My name is Declan Rousseau. I'm a locksmith and I survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak trapped inside a New Orleans hospital. 3 days ago, I was installing security systems when patients started dying from flu vaccines and coming back as flesh-eating monsters. Now I'm barricaded in a supply closet with dozens of zombies scratching at my door, and my lock-picking skills are the only thing keeping me alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Declan Rousseau, and if you're watching this, it means you've survived long enough to find a working device with internet access. That alone makes you luckier than most people right now. I'm broadcasting this from what's left of Ochsner Medical Center in New Orleans, and I need you to listen carefully to every word I'm about to tell you because your life might depend on it. 3 days ago on October 13th, 2024, I walked into this hospital as a locksmith doing a routine security installation job. I walked out as one of the few people who witnessed the very beginning of what everyone's calling the zombie outbreak. But here's what nobody's telling you on the news broadcasts that are still running. This wasn't some random plague or mysterious virus that appeared out of nowhere. This was man-made, and I have the documents to prove it. Let me start from the beginning because the details matter. Every single detail could save your life or the lives of people you care about. I arrived at Ochsner Medical Center that Monday morning at exactly 7:30, same as I always do when I have a commercial installation. My company, Rousseau Security Solutions, had been contracted to upgrade the pharmacy's lock systems. Nothing fancy, just replacing some older electronic locks with newer models that had better access logging. Standard stuff that I'd done hundreds of times before. But the moment I pulled into the parking lot, I knew something was different. In my 15 years of doing security work at medical facilities, I'd never seen so many CDC vehicles in one place. There had to be at least 8 or 9 white government SUVs parked in the emergency lot, and that's not counting the unmarked sedans that screamed federal agents from a mile away. When you spend your life getting into places you're not supposed to be, you develop an eye for spotting people who don't belong. My grandfather taught me that every building tells a story if you know how to read it. He was a locksmith too. Learned the trade in the French Quarter back when everything was still done with mechanical pins and tumblers. He used to say that the real skill wasn't just opening locks, it was understanding why people put them there in the first place. What are they protecting? What are they afraid of? That morning, Ochsner Medical Center was afraid of something big. I checked in at the main security desk like always, showed my credentials, got my temporary badge. The guard who processed me was a guy named Ramon Vasquez, built like a linebacker with graying temples and tired eyes. He'd been working hospital security for 12 years, and we'd chatted during previous jobs. But that morning, Ramon looked like he hadn't slept in days. When I asked him about all the government vehicles, he just shook his head and said the hospital was running some kind of special vaccination program for the seasonal flu. Now here's the first thing you need to understand about what happened. The flu season that year was supposed to be the worst in decades. The CDC had been warning since August that the strain they were tracking was particularly aggressive, especially dangerous for elderly people and anyone with compromised immune systems. So when the government announced they had fast-tracked a new vaccine specifically designed to combat this strain, people were relieved. They were lining up to get their shots. As I made my way through the hospital corridors toward the pharmacy, I passed the main vaccination area they'd set up in the East Wing. The line stretched from the clinic all the way down to the main lobby. Hundreds of people, mostly older folks, some families with children, all waiting patiently for their turn to get protected against the flu. The atmosphere was almost festive. People were chatting, laughing, treating it like a community event. Nobody suspected they were walking into a death trap. The pharmacy was on the 3rd floor, and I took the service elevator to avoid the crowds. That's when I first noticed the unusual number of security personnel throughout the building. Not just Ramon and the regular hospital guards, but men in dark suits with earpieces who were clearly federal agents. They weren't trying to hide their presence, but they weren't advertising it either. They positioned themselves at key locations throughout the hospital, watching everything with the kind of professional awareness that comes from serious training. When I reached the pharmacy, I met Dr. Patricia Chen, the head pharmacist who would be overseeing my work. Dr. Chen was probably in her early 40s, precise and professional. The kind of person who kept detailed records of everything. She explained that they needed the new locks installed as quickly as possible because they were storing a much larger quantity of medications than usual. Special shipments had arrived over the weekend, she said, and hospital administration wanted enhanced security measures in place immediately. As she showed me around the pharmacy, pointing out which cabinets and storage areas needed new locks, I noticed something interesting. Most of the special medications she mentioned were neurological drugs. Sedatives, anti-seizure medications, drugs used to treat brain injuries and neurological disorders. When I asked about it, Dr. Chen got uncomfortable and said it was just standard preparation for potential complications from the new vaccine. Some people might have adverse reactions, she explained, and they wanted to be prepared for anything. That should have been my second warning sign, but I was focused on the job. I started with the main medication storage area, a large walk-in vault that housed the most valuable and dangerous drugs. The existing lock system was at least 10 years old, completely mechanical, the kind of thing my grandfather would have been comfortable with. The new system was state-of-the-art electronic, with biometric scanners and detailed access logging that would track exactly who entered the vault and when. While I worked, I could hear conversations happening throughout the hospital over the intercom system, doctors being paged, updates about vaccination schedules, the usual hospital chatter. But mixed in with the routine announcements, I started hearing things that didn't make sense. References to something called containment protocols, mentions of CDC observers monitoring vaccination procedures, requests for additional security personnel to report to specific floors. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I was installing a new lock on a cabinet that contained what Dr. Chen called emergency neurological medications when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two men in dark suits were talking just outside the pharmacy, thinking they were speaking quietly enough that nobody would hear them. One of them was talking into a phone, and I caught fragments of what he was saying. He mentioned something about baseline readings and acceptable loss percentages. He talked about contingency plans and evacuation protocols. Most disturbing of all, he referred to the vaccination site as a test location. When the other man asked him about timeline expectations, he said they should start seeing results within 6 to 8 hours of initial administration. Results. Not protection from the flu. Results. I kept working, but my grandfather's voice was echoing in my head. He always told me that when you're working in a building, you're not just a locksmith. You're a witness. You see things other people miss because you're focused on security, on what people are trying to protect or keep out. And what I was witnessing at Ochsner Medical Center that morning was preparation for something much bigger than a routine vaccination program. By 11:30, I had finished installing the main vault lock and moved on to the smaller medication cabinets. Dr. Chen stayed close, supposedly to answer any questions I might have, but I got the impression she was also watching me. Making sure I didn't see anything I wasn't supposed to see. But when you've been picking locks professionally for 15 years, you develop peripheral vision that most people don't have. You learn to observe everything while appearing to focus on your immediate task. That's how I noticed the CDC official making urgent phone calls from the hallway outside the pharmacy. He was a thin man in his 50s, wearing the kind of expensive suit that screamed government authority. Every few minutes his phone would ring and he'd step away from whoever he was with to take the call privately. From what I could overhear, he was getting updates from multiple locations, not just Ochsner, but vaccination sites across the city, maybe across the state. During one of these calls, I heard him mention batch numbers, specific identification codes for the vaccine doses being administered. He was tracking them, comparing results from different locations, adjusting protocols based on what he was learning. This wasn't routine medical oversight. This was data collection from some kind of experiment. The lunch hour brought a temporary lull in the vaccination program, but the atmosphere in the hospital remained tense. I was working on my final cabinet lock when Dr. Chen received a phone call that changed everything. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her responses told me everything I needed to know. Someone was reporting problems with patients who had received the vaccine earlier that morning. Dr. Chen kept saying things like, "How many?" and "What kind of symptoms?" and "Are you sure about the timeline?" When she hung up, she immediately called someone else, probably hospital administration, and reported that they were seeing adverse reactions sooner than expected. She used medical terminology I didn't understand, but her tone made it clear that whatever was happening was serious. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I had finished installing all the requested locks and was completing my paperwork when the first ambulance arrived, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. Through the pharmacy windows, I could see paramedics wheeling patients into the emergency department, and every single one of those patients looked like they were in severe distress. I should have left then. My job was done. My invoice was completed, and I had other appointments that afternoon. But something kept me there. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe it was my grandfather's voice reminding me to pay attention to the story the building was telling. Either way, I decided to take a longer route back to the main lobby, just to see what was happening in the vaccination area. What I found was controlled chaos. The festive atmosphere from the morning had been replaced by barely contained panic. Medical personnel were moving with urgent purpose, wheeling patients from the vaccination area directly to the emergency department. The line of people waiting for vaccines had been suspended, with security guards politely but firmly asking people to reschedule their appointments. I found Ramon near the main entrance, and he looked even more exhausted than he had that morning. When I asked him what was going on, he said they were dealing with some unexpected reactions to the new vaccine. Nothing serious, he claimed, just being extra cautious. But his body language told a different story. His hand kept drifting to his radio, and his eyes constantly scanned the lobby like he was expecting trouble. That's when I saw her for the first time. Mrs. Evangeline Boudreau, a woman in her 70s who lived in the Treme neighborhood and had been one of the first people vaccinated that morning. She was being wheeled back into the emergency department on a gurney, and she looked terrible. Her skin had a grayish pallor, her breathing was labored, and she appeared to be unconscious. The medical team surrounding her was working frantically, checking her vital signs and adjusting IV tubes. I watched them wheel her into emergency room 3, and then I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of leaving the hospital, I found a chair in the main lobby where I could observe what was happening. I told myself I was just being cautious, making sure there wasn't some kind of chemical contamination or airborne illness that might affect me. But the truth was, my locksmith instincts were screaming that something was very wrong with the entire situation. Over the next hour, I watched more patients arrive by ambulance. All of them had been vaccinated that morning. All of them showed similar symptoms: severe neurological distress, respiratory problems, and a distinctive grayish skin tone that I'd never seen before. The medical staff was clearly overwhelmed, but they were also following protocols that seemed predetermined, like they had been expecting this to happen. Around 3 o'clock, I noticed that the CDC officials were no longer trying to be discreet. They had set up a command center in one of the conference rooms, and they were coordinating with multiple agencies. I could see them through the glass walls, pointing at charts and graphs, making phone calls, and typing rapidly on laptops. Whatever was happening at Oxner was part of something much larger. That's when I realized I needed to get closer to the emergency department, not because I wanted to interfere, but because my professional experience told me that the real story was happening in the areas with the highest security, the places they didn't want random people to see. So I did what any experienced locksmith would do. I found a legitimate reason to be in a restricted area. I approached the main security desk and told Ramon that I had left some of my tools in the pharmacy and needed to retrieve them. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had intentionally left a small toolkit there as insurance just in case I needed access to the upper floors later. Ramon was distracted enough by the ongoing crisis that he gave me a temporary pass without asking too many questions. As I made my way back through the hospital corridors, I could hear conversations that painted a much more serious picture than what anyone was admitting publicly. Doctors were talking about unprecedented neurological responses. Nurses were discussing isolation, protocols, and requesting additional security for certain patient rooms. Over the intercom, there were constant calls for specific medical specialists, particularly neurologists and infectious disease experts. When I reached the third floor, instead of going directly to the pharmacy, I took a detour past the emergency department's observation area. Through the partially open door of emergency room 3, I could see Mrs. Boudreau lying motionless on the examination table. Her condition had clearly deteriorated since I'd seen her earlier. Her skin was now a deep grayish white, and there were no visible signs of breathing. The medical team around her was no longer working frantically. They had the subdued professional demeanor that comes when doctors have done everything they can do. I heard one of them quietly tell a nurse to prepare the paperwork for time of death. Mrs. Evangeline Boudreau, a 73-year-old grandmother from Tremé who had come in that morning to protect herself from the flu, was dead. I retrieved my toolkit from the pharmacy and was heading back toward the main lobby when I heard the first scream. It came from emergency room 3, the same room where Mrs. Boudreau had just been pronounced dead. Then I heard shouting, the sound of medical equipment being knocked over, and what sounded like a physical struggle. By the time I reached the emergency department, absolute chaos had erupted. Medical personnel were running in every direction, some of them covered in blood, all of them shouting instructions and warnings. Through the doorway of emergency room 3, I could see the source of the panic. Mrs. Evangeline Boudreau was sitting up on the examination table. The same woman who had been declared dead minutes earlier was not only alive, she was attacking the medical staff with a savagery that defied explanation. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like someone who had forgotten how their body was supposed to work. But there was nothing confused or disoriented about her actions. She was deliberately and methodically trying to bite anyone who came within reach. The most disturbing part wasn't the attack itself, it was her eyes. Mrs. Boudreau's eyes had changed from the warm brown I'd noticed that morning to a milky, unfocused white. She looked at the medical staff around her not with recognition or confusion, but with the single-minded hunger of a predator that had found prey. 2 security guards, including Ramon, rushed into the room to help restrain her. But Mrs. Boudreau displayed strength that seemed impossible for a 73-year-old woman who had been dead moments before. She threw off the first guard like he weighed nothing, and sank her teeth into his forearm with enough force to tear through his uniform and into the muscle beneath. That's when I understood that everything I thought I knew about the world had just changed forever. This wasn't a medical emergency or an adverse reaction to a vaccine. This was something else entirely. Something that turned dead people into monsters. As I watched Ramon and the other security personnel finally manage to restrain Mrs. Boudreau, I realized that my locksmith skills might be the only thing standing between me and whatever was about to happen next. Because if one vaccinated patient could come back from the dead with an insatiable desire to attack the living, how many others were about to follow? The intercom system crackled to life with an announcement that made my blood freeze. Code Gray, all floors. Code Gray, all floors. All personnel implement containment protocols immediately. I had never heard Code Gray before, but from the immediate response of every medical professional within sight, it was clear that this was the moment they had been preparing for all along. The moment when their experiment stopped being theoretical and became a fight for survival. And I was trapped right in the middle of it, with nothing but my lockpicking tools and 15 years of experience getting into places I wasn't supposed to be. As I watched more patients in other emergency rooms beginning to show the same symptoms that had killed and revived Mrs. Boudreau, I realized that the next 72 hours were going to test every skill I had ever learned. The zombie outbreak had begun, and I was about to discover just how much my grandfather's teachings about reading the stories that buildings tell would matter when the story became a matter of life and death. The announcement of Code Gray changed everything in a matter of seconds. Within minutes of that intercom call, the hospital transformed from a place of healing into something that resembled a military operation. Medical staff who had been treating patients moments before were suddenly implementing procedures that seemed rehearsed, like they had been drilling for this exact scenario. I watched from my position near the emergency department as teams of personnel began sealing off entire sections of the hospital. They weren't just closing doors, they were engaging heavy-duty security measures that I recognized from my professional experience. magnetic locks that could only be opened from central security, reinforced barriers that would require specialized tools to breach, and communication systems that allowed coordination between different containment zones. This wasn't a response to an unexpected medical emergency. This was the execution of a predetermined plan. As I tried to process what I was witnessing, more patients in the emergency department began showing the same progression that had killed and revived Mrs. Boudreau. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. First came the severe neurological distress, followed by respiratory failure, then apparent death. But within minutes of being pronounced dead, they would return to consciousness with that same milky-eyed stare and predatory hunger. The medical staff was ready for it. Too ready. They had isolation protocols, restraint procedures, and communication codes that suggested they had been expecting this outcome. When the second patient, an elderly man who had been vaccinated early that morning, sat up on his examination table and attacked a nurse, the response was swift and coordinated. Security personnel arrived with specialized restraints, medical staff administered sedatives that had been prepared in advance, and the patient was transferred to a secure location within minutes. But here's what terrified me most about watching this unfold. The medical staff wasn't panicking. They were following a script. I needed to get out of the main hospital corridors before someone noticed that I didn't belong there anymore. My temporary security pass was legitimate, but it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny if someone decided to check why a locksmith was still in the building hours after completing his job. Using my knowledge of the hospital's layout from the security installation work, I made my way toward a supply closet on the third floor that would give me a secure location to observe and plan my next move. The supply closet was perfect for my needs. It had a solid door with a good lock, limited visibility from the corridor, and a small window that allowed me to monitor activity in the main hallway. More importantly, it contained medical supplies that might be useful, and it was located near a stairwell that would give me multiple escape routes if necessary. As I settled into my temporary hideout, I could hear the chaos continuing throughout the hospital over the intercom system. But it wasn't random chaos. The announcements were specific and coordinated. Medical teams were being directed to predetermined locations. Security personnel were implementing containment measures that had clearly been planned in advance. Even the language they used suggested extensive preparation. They kept referencing something called Protocol Lazarus. Over the next several hours, I watched through my small window as the hospital staff either evacuated certain areas or were reassigned to specific containment duties. The civilian population, the people who had come for routine medical care or to visit patients, were systematically removed from the building, not in a panic, but through organized evacuation procedures that guided them to exits while keeping them away from the areas where the vaccinated patients were being held. By late afternoon, the hospital felt like a different place entirely. The normal sounds of medical activity had been replaced by the mechanical hum of ventilation systems, the electronic beeping of monitoring equipment, and the occasional burst of radio communication between security teams. Most disturbing of all were the sounds coming from the areas where the affected patients were being contained. Scratching, banging, and what could only be described as growling. Around 6 o'clock that evening, I witnessed something that confirmed my worst suspicions about what was really happening. A team of CDC officials, the same ones I had observed that morning, arrived at the third floor with equipment that had nothing to do with medical treatment. They were carrying digital cameras, laptop computers, and data collection devices. They weren't there to help the patients. They were there to document the results of their experiment. I watched through my window as they set up their equipment outside the containment areas and began recording the behavior of the affected patients. They were taking notes, measuring responses, and discussing their observations with the clinical detachment of scientists studying laboratory specimens. These weren't doctors trying to save lives. These were researchers collecting data from a field test. That's when I realized that everyone who had received the vaccine that morning was part of an experiment they never consented to participate in. The CDC hadn't fast-tracked a flu vaccine to protect people from a dangerous strain of influenza. They had used a public health crisis as cover to test something else entirely, something that killed people and brought them back as monsters. As the evening progressed, I could hear radio communications that painted an increasingly grim picture of what was happening beyond the walls of Oxnard Medical Center. The CDC officials were receiving reports from other locations, other vaccination sites, where the same protocols were being implemented. This wasn't limited to one hospital or even one city. The experiment was being conducted simultaneously across multiple locations. The scope of what they had done was staggering. Thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, had been given an experimental substance disguised as a flu vaccine. Most of them had no idea what was happening to them until it was too late. They had trusted their government and their medical system to protect them, and instead they had been turned into test subjects in an experiment that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Around 8 o'clock that evening, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my supply closet. Slow, deliberate footsteps that didn't match the purposeful stride of medical personnel or security guards. Through the small window, I could see a figure moving past my hiding place with the same jerky, unnatural gait that I had observed in Mrs. Boudreau and the other affected patients. One of them had escaped containment. The figure was wearing a hospital gown, and I could see enough of his profile to recognize him as one of the patients I had observed being taken to the emergency department earlier that day. His skin had the same grayish-white pallor, and his movements had the same predatory quality. But what chilled me was the systematic way he was moving through the corridor. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was searching. I watched him stop at each door, testing the handles, listening for sounds from within. When he reached a door that was unlocked, he would push it open and investigate the room beyond. His behavior suggested a level of problem-solving ability that contradicted everything I thought I knew about mindless zombies from movies and television. This thing was capable of learning and adapting. Over the next hour, I observed similar figures moving through different parts of the hospital. Some were former patients. Others appeared to be medical staff who had been infected during the initial outbreak. All of them displayed the same systematic search behavior, the same problem-solving capabilities, and the same predatory focus. They were hunting. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a conversation over the radio system that made me understand just how much danger I was in. Security personnel were reporting multiple containment breaches throughout the hospital. The affected individuals were not only escaping their isolation areas, they were working together to overcome security measures. They were communicating with each other through sounds and gestures that suggested a form of collective intelligence. But here's what terrified me most about that radio conversation. The security personnel weren't trying to recapture the escaped subjects. They were implementing evacuation protocols for essential personnel while leaving the affected individuals free to roam the hospital. The experiment had moved into a new phase, and they were collecting data on how the subjects behaved when given unrestricted access to a controlled environment. The hospital had become a testing ground, and anyone still inside was either a researcher or a test subject. I realized that my supply closet, which had seemed like a safe hiding place, was actually a trap. If the affected individuals were systematically searching every room in the hospital, it was only a matter of time before one of them found me. I needed to find a more secure location, preferably one that would allow me to observe what was happening, while keeping me out of reach of the hunters stalking the corridors. Using my Locksmith knowledge of the hospital's layout, I identified a location that would serve my needs. The pediatric ward on the 4th floor had enhanced security measures because of the sensitive nature of treating children. The doors were equipped with electronic locks that required keycards for access, and the windows were reinforced to prevent unauthorized entry. Most importantly, the ward had been evacuated earlier in the day, which meant it would be empty of both medical personnel and affected patients. Getting there would require crossing 2 floors of hospital corridors that were now prowled by creatures that had once been human beings. But staying in the supply closet would mean certain discovery, and I had seen enough of their behavior to know that discovery would mean death. I gathered the medical supplies that might be useful and prepared to make my move. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that stopped me cold. Voices in the corridor outside. Human voices, speaking in whispers. Through my window, I could see 3 people moving carefully down the hallway. 2 women and a man, all wearing hospital identification badges. all looking terrified, but determined. One of the women was Dr. Patricia Chen from the pharmacy. The man was Ramon, the security guard who had processed my entry that morning. The third person was someone I didn't recognize, a younger woman in scrubs who appeared to be a nurse. They were survivors, and they were trying to navigate the same dangerous situation that I was facing. I had a choice to make. I could remain, hidden in my supply closet and hope they passed by without incident, or I could reveal myself and offer to help them reach a more secure location. My locksmith skills might be exactly what they needed to access areas of the hospital that would provide better protection from the hunters stalking the corridors. But making contact with other survivors would also mean taking responsibility for their safety, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of commitment. My grandfather had always taught me that the first rule of security work was to assess the risks before making any move that couldn't be undone. As I watched them move past my hiding place, I could see that they were heading toward the main stairwell, the same route I had planned to use to reach the pediatric ward. If they continued in that direction, they would encounter at least 2 of the affected individuals that I had observed patrolling that area. Their chances of surviving that encounter without help were essentially 0. The decision made itself. I couldn't watch 3 people walk into a death trap when I had the skills and knowledge to help them avoid it. I opened the supply closet, door just wide enough to get their attention without making noise that would attract unwanted interest from other parts of the hospital. Dr. Chen saw me first, and her expression showed a mixture of relief and suspicion. She recognized me as the locksmith who had been working in her pharmacy, but she couldn't understand why I was still in the hospital. I motioned for them to join me in the supply closet, and after a moment of hesitation, they did. Once the door was closed and locked behind them, I explained my situation as quickly and quietly as possible. I told them about witnessing the initial outbreak, about observing the systematic behavior of the affected individuals, and about my plan to reach the pediatric ward where we could establish a more secure position. Ramon's response confirmed what I had suspected about the hospital's preparation for this crisis. He told me that hospital administration had been conducting special security drills for the past several weeks, supposedly in response to increased concerns about terrorism and workplace violence. But the drills had focused specifically on containment procedures and evacuation protocols that matched exactly what they had implemented that day. Dr. Chen added another piece to the puzzle. She revealed that the special medication shipments she had mentioned that morning weren't just neurological drugs. They included experimental compounds that she had been told were for treating potential adverse reactions to the new vaccine. But when she had researched the medications, she discovered that they were actually designed to enhance neurological function in deceased tissue. The nurse, whose name was Sarah Martinez, had been working in the emergency department when the first patients began showing symptoms. She had observed the medical staff implementing procedures that they claimed were standard protocol for neurological emergencies, but which she had never seen before in 5 years of emergency medicine. Most disturbing, she had noticed that some of the medical staff seemed to be expecting the patients to die and return to consciousness. The 3 of them had found each other when the evacuation procedures separated essential personnel from support staff. They had realized that the official evacuation routes were designed to guide different groups of people to different destinations, and they suspected that not all of those destinations were safe. So they had decided to find their own way out of the hospital, avoiding the official channels that might lead them into additional danger. Their information confirmed my analysis of the situation, but it also revealed that the scope of the conspiracy was even larger than I had realized. This wasn't just a CDC experiment using unwilling test subjects. This was a coordinated operation involving hospital administration, medical staff, and security personnel who had been planning and preparing for months. We spent the next hour developing a plan to reach the pediatric ward safely. My knowledge of the hospital's security systems would be crucial for accessing the restricted areas, while Ramon's familiarity with security protocols would help us avoid detection by any remaining personnel who might still be monitoring the situation. Dr. Chen's medical expertise would be essential if we encountered anyone who had been injured but not infected, and Sarah's knowledge of emergency procedures would help us respond to unexpected situations. But as we prepared to leave the supply closet, we heard something that changed everything. Radio chatter from security personnel indicating that the affected individuals weren't just escaping containment randomly. They were being directed to specific locations throughout the hospital by handlers who were coordinating their movements. The experiment had evolved beyond simple observation. The researchers were now actively controlling the test subjects, using them to hunt down anyone who might have witnessed the initial phase of the operation. They weren't just collecting data on zombie behavior. They were using the zombies as weapons to eliminate potential witnesses. We weren't just survivors trying to escape a medical disaster. We were targets in a cleanup operation designed to ensure that the truth about what had happened at Ochsner Medical Center would never be revealed to the outside world. The next phase of our survival would require not just avoiding the affected individuals but outmaneuvering the people who were controlling them. And as we prepared to leave our temporary refuge, I realized that my locksmith skills were about to be tested in ways that my grandfather could never have imagined when he taught me that every building tells a story. The story that Ochsner Medical Center was telling was one of betrayal, conspiracy, and murder disguised as medical research. And the four of us were the only witnesses left alive to tell that story to the world. The four of us spent the rest of that first night establishing what we thought was a secure position in the pediatric ward. My locksmith skills had gotten us through 3 separate security barriers, and Ramon's knowledge of the hospital's surveillance system helped us avoid the remaining security cameras that were still operational. By dawn on October 14th, we had created what felt like a safe haven in a world that had become completely insane. The pediatric ward was perfect for our needs. The enhanced security measures meant that the affected individuals couldn't easily breach our defenses, and the multiple escape routes gave us options if our position became compromised. More importantly, the ward had been completely evacuated before the outbreak began, which meant we didn't have to worry about encountering any infected children or staff members who might have been trapped during the initial chaos. Dr. Chen had found medical supplies that would last us several days, and Sarah had located emergency rations that were stored for disaster situations. Ramon had access to radio equipment that allowed us to monitor security communications throughout the hospital, and I had identified multiple routes we could use to move between different areas of the building if necessary. For the first time, since witnessing Mrs. Boudreau's transformation, I felt like we might actually survive this nightmare. But our sense of security was built on incomplete information about what we were really facing. Over the next 12 hours, we monitored radio communications that revealed the true scope of the operation that had been conducted at Ochsner Medical Center. The CDC officials weren't just documenting the behavior of individual test subjects. They were studying how the affected individuals functioned as a collective group, how they communicated with each other, and how they could be directed to accomplish specific objectives. What we were witnessing wasn't a medical disaster that had spiraled out of control. It was a weapons test. The conversations we intercepted made it clear that similar experiments were being conducted simultaneously at vaccination sites across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. Thousands of people had been given the experimental substance, and the results were being compiled into a comprehensive database that would be used to refine the process for future deployments. The flu vaccine had been a delivery system for something that turned ordinary citizens into biological weapons that could be controlled and directed by their handlers. By Tuesday morning, we had established radio contact with survivor groups in other parts of New Orleans. The outbreak wasn't limited to Ochsner Medical Center. Every major vaccination site in the city had experienced similar incidents, and the affected individuals were spreading throughout the metropolitan area. But unlike the random zombie apocalypse scenarios depicted in movies and television, this outbreak was being managed and contained by the same people who had created it. The survivors we spoke with reported seeing military personnel and CDC officials coordinating the movement of affected individuals through specific neighborhoods. They weren't allowing the outbreak to spread randomly. They were using it to test urban containment strategies, population control measures, and emergency response protocols. The entire city of New Orleans had become a testing ground for biological warfare tactics. This revelation changed our understanding of our own situation. We weren't just hiding from mindless zombies in an abandoned hospital. We were trapped inside a research facility where experiments were still being conducted, and we were potential test subjects who had witnessed more of the operation than we were supposed to see. That Tuesday afternoon, we intercepted a radio communication that confirmed our worst fears. Security personnel were reporting our presence in the pediatric ward to CDC officials, and they were developing plans to capture us for what they called debriefing and integration into the experimental protocol. They knew exactly where we were, and they were allowing us to remain there because our behavior as informed survivors was providing them with additional research data. We had been under observation the entire time. Ramon's security training kicked in immediately. He began implementing counter-surveillance measures, using his knowledge of the hospital's camera system to identify blind spots and create false patterns of movement that would confuse anyone monitoring our activities. But he also confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The level of coordination and preparation we had observed could only have been achieved through months or even years of advanced planning. The CDC officials, hospital administration, and security personnel hadn't just been preparing for this specific operation. They had been testing and refining biological warfare protocols, using American citizens as unwilling test subjects, and what happened at Oxnard Medical Center was just the latest and largest of these experiments. Dr. Chen's analysis of the medications she had been asked to stock confirmed this timeline. The neurological drugs weren't just for treating adverse reactions to the vaccine. They were designed to enhance and control the neurological function of deceased tissue, allowing the affected individuals to retain enough cognitive ability to follow complex instructions while eliminating their emotional responses and moral inhibitions. The transformation process was precisely engineered to create biological weapons that could be directed against specific targets while remaining controllable by their handlers. Sarah's observations from the emergency department added another, disturbing element to our understanding. She had noticed that some of the medical staff seemed to be immune to infection, even after being bitten by affected patients. When she had asked about this, she was told that essential personnel had received a different vaccine, one that provided protection against the experimental substance. The people conducting the experiment had protected themselves while deliberately exposing the civilian population to a weapon designed to kill them and turn them into monsters. This information fundamentally changed our survival strategy. We weren't dealing with a containable medical emergency that would eventually be resolved by outside authorities. We were facing a government operation that was designed to test biological weapons on American soil, using American citizens as test subjects. No one was coming to rescue us, because the people who should have been organizing rescue operations were the same people conducting the experiment. We needed to find a way to document what we had witnessed and transmit that information to people outside the testing area who could expose what was happening. But doing so would require accessing communication equipment that was located in heavily monitored areas of the hospital, and it would mean risking capture by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to murder innocent civilians in the name of weapons research. That Tuesday evening, we made the decision to attempt reaching the hospital's emergency broadcast system. The equipment was located on the 6th floor, in an area that was heavily secured under normal circumstances, and was now being actively patrolled by both affected individuals and their handlers. But it was also our only chance to contact the outside world and reveal the truth about what had been done to the people of New Orleans. The plan required using every skill and piece of knowledge that each of us possessed. My locksmith expertise would be essential for bypassing the security systems protecting the broadcast equipment. Ramon's understanding of hospital security protocols would help us avoid detection during our movement through the building. Dr. Chen's medical knowledge would be crucial if we encountered injured survivors or needed to treat infection from contact with affected individuals. Sarah's emergency response training would help us react quickly to unexpected situations and provide medical care under pressure. But as we prepared for what we knew would be the most dangerous phase of our survival, we intercepted a radio communication that revealed something that changed everything we thought we understood about our situation. Ramon was infected. The radio chatter indicated that security personnel had been tracking biometric data from the hospital's access control system, and they had detected elevated stress hormones and altered brain chemistry in Ramon's security badge readings that were consistent with early-stage infection from the experimental substance. He had been exposed during one of our movements through the hospital corridors, probably through airborne particles or contact with contaminated surfaces, and the infection was progressing slowly enough that he wasn't showing obvious symptoms yet. But according to the timeline described in the radio communications, he would begin showing signs of neurological deterioration within the next 6 to 8 hours, followed by the same death and resurrection cycle that we had observed in other affected individuals. The people monitoring us knew that Ramon was infected, and they were allowing the situation to develop because they wanted to study how the infection progressed in someone who was aware of his condition and actively trying to resist it. They were using his infection as another data point in their research, and they were using our reactions to that infection as additional information about group dynamics under extreme stress. We were all test subjects now, whether we realized it or not. Ramon's response to learning about his infection revealed the kind of person he really was. Instead of panicking or becoming desperate, he immediately began planning how to maximize his remaining time to help the rest of us accomplish our mission. He knew that his condition would eventually make him a danger to Dr. Chen, Sarah, and me. But he also knew that his security knowledge and access credentials were essential for reaching the broadcast equipment. The next several hours tested every aspect of our group's ability to function under extreme psychological pressure. We had to continue working together as a team while knowing that one of our members was slowly transforming into the same kind of monster we were trying to avoid. We had to maintain operational security while dealing with the emotional reality that we were going to lose someone we had come to depend on for survival. But Ramon's infection also provided us with intelligence about how the experimental substance actually worked. He was able to describe the progression of symptoms from the inside, giving us information about the neurological effects that we couldn't have obtained any other way. His reports helped us understand that the affected individuals retained more cognitive function than we had initially realized, which explained their ability to work together and follow complex instructions from their handlers. By Wednesday morning, Ramon was showing obvious signs of neurological deterioration, but he was still functional enough to guide us through the hospital's security systems. We knew that we had a limited window of time to reach the broadcast equipment before his condition progressed to the point where he would become a danger to the rest of us. The plan we developed required precise timing and flawless execution. We would use Ramon's security access to disable monitoring systems in specific sections of the hospital, creating blind spots that would allow us to move toward the 6th floor without being tracked. Dr. Chen would carry the medical supplies we might need if anyone was injured during the mission. Sarah would handle communication with any other survivor groups we might encounter, and I would be responsible for bypassing any security measures that Ramon's access couldn't overcome. But as we prepared to leave the pediatric ward for what we knew would be our final mission together, we received a radio transmission that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy we had stumbled into. The voice was that of a CDC official, and he was reporting to someone he addressed as director about the success of what he called the New Orleans field test. The experimental substance hadn't just been tested at vaccination sites in Louisiana and surrounding states. It had been deployed in limited trials across dozens of American cities over the past 2 years, with each test providing data that was used to refine the process for larger deployments. The people conducting these experiments had been systematically testing biological weapons on American citizens for years, using public health programs as cover for operations that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. But what made this information truly terrifying was the officials' reference to something called the National Implementation Phase. The New Orleans test wasn't just another research project. It was the final evaluation before deploying the experimental substance on a nationwide scale, using a manufactured public health crisis to justify mandatory vaccination programs that would transform millions of Americans into controllable biological weapons. The flu season that had provided cover for the New Orleans operation wasn't a natural phenomenon. It had been engineered to create public demand for the very vaccines that contained the experimental substance. The entire crisis From the initial outbreak of aggressive flu strains to the fast-track development of experimental vaccines, had been orchestrated to provide justification for the largest biological weapons test in human history. We weren't just witnessing the aftermath of a single experimental program. We were seeing the final phase of preparation for an operation that would fundamentally transform American society by turning ordinary citizens into weapons that could be controlled by their own government. This revelation made our mission to reach the broadcast equipment infinitely more important and more dangerous. We weren't just trying to expose what had happened in New Orleans. We were trying to prevent a nationwide catastrophe that would affect millions of people. But we were also facing an enemy with virtually unlimited resources and the full authority of the federal government behind their operations. As we prepared to leave the safety of the pediatric ward, I realized that my grandfather's teachings about reading the stories that buildings tell had prepared me for this moment in ways I could never have anticipated. The story that Ochsner Medical Center was telling wasn't just about medical research gone wrong. It was about the systematic betrayal of public trust by people who had sworn to protect and serve the American people. And the four of us, 3.5 really considering Ramon's condition, were the only people in a position to make sure that story reached the outside world before it was too late to prevent a national disaster. The next phase of our mission would test not just our individual skills and knowledge, but our ability to function as a team when one of our members was slowly transforming into the very thing we were fighting against. And as we prepared to venture into the most dangerous areas of the hospital, I knew that everything we had learned about survival, about trust, and about the price of truth was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether the American people would ever learn what had been done to them in the name of national security. Our mission to reach the broadcast equipment began at 4 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, 48 hours after I had first witnessed Mrs. Boudreau's transformation in Emergency Room 3. Ramon's condition had deteriorated significantly over the past several hours, but he was still lucid enough to guide us through the hospital's security systems. We knew this would be our last chance to work together as a complete team. The route to the 6th floor required crossing 3 separate security zones, each with different types of access controls and monitoring systems. Under normal circumstances, reaching the broadcast equipment would have been impossible for unauthorized personnel. But Ramon's security credentials, combined with my locksmith skills and our collective knowledge of the hospital's layout, gave us a realistic chance of success. The first challenge was leaving the pediatric ward without alerting the personnel who were monitoring our activities. Ramon used his administrative access to create false maintenance alerts in other parts of the hospital, drawing security attention away from our actual location. While their monitoring systems were focused on investigating these phantom problems, we slipped out of the pediatric ward through a service corridor that connected to the main elevator shaft. My locksmith training had taught me to always identify multiple escape routes when working in unfamiliar buildings, and that habit served us well during our movement through the hospital. Instead of using the obvious routes that would be monitored and potentially blocked, we traveled through maintenance areas, storage rooms, and service corridors that most people didn't even know existed. But as we made our way toward the central elevator bank, we encountered something that revealed just how much the hospital had changed since the beginning of the outbreak. The affected individuals weren't wandering randomly through the corridors anymore. They were positioned at strategic locations throughout the building, functioning as a coordinated security system that could detect and respond to unauthorized movement. These weren't mindless zombies shambling aimlessly through abandoned hallways. They were sentries with enough cognitive function to recognize threats and communicate with each other through a combination of sounds and gestures that their handlers had apparently taught them. When one of them detected something unusual, the information was relayed through the group until it reached whoever was coordinating their activities. We observed this communication system in action when a maintenance worker who had apparently been hiding in the building since the outbreak began tried to reach one of the emergency exits. The affected individual who spotted him didn't attack immediately. Instead, it made a series of specific sounds that were picked up and repeated by other affected individuals throughout that section of the hospital. Within minutes, a group of them had surrounded the maintenance worker's location and captured him alive. What happened next confirmed our worst fears about the true purpose of the experiments being conducted at Oxner Medical Center. Instead of killing the maintenance worker, the affected individuals held him while personnel in protective suits arrived to collect him. He wasn't eliminated as a potential witness. He was taken to what they called a processing area, where he would be infected with the experimental substance and transformed into another controllable test subject. The people conducting this operation weren't just testing biological weapons. They were refining techniques for converting resistant populations into compliant ones through forced infection and neurological modification. This revelation forced us to completely revise our understanding of what we were facing. The affected individuals weren't just weapons designed to kill enemy populations. They were tools for converting those populations into additional weapons that could be controlled and directed. The experimental substance didn't just create zombies, it created a self-replicating system for expanding the number of controllable biological weapons available to whoever possessed the technology to direct them. Our movement through the hospital became infinitely more dangerous once we understood. The capture would mean forced conversion rather than quick death. We couldn't afford to be spotted by the affected individuals, but we also couldn't afford to leave any trace of our passage that might alert their handlers to our presence. Ramon's security knowledge became crucial for navigating this enhanced threat environment. He knew which areas of the hospital had motion sensors, which corridors were monitored by cameras, and which routes would minimize our exposure to both technological surveillance and biological sentries. But his condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I could see that maintaining focus was becoming increasingly difficult for him. The progression of Ramon's infection was both heartbreaking and terrifying to witness. The man who had been our steady, reliable guide through the hospital's security systems was slowly losing his ability to think clearly and control his impulses. He would start to explain something important about the hospital's layout, then lose his train of thought mid-sentence. His hands, which had been steady enough to operate complex security equipment, began to shake with tremors that he couldn't control. But what was most disturbing was the way his personality began to change. Ramon had always been protective of the people around him, but as the infection progressed, that protective instinct began to transform into something more aggressive and predatory. He would look at Dr. Chen, Sarah, and me with an intensity that hadn't been there before, as if he was evaluating us as potential threats or prey. By early evening, we had successfully reached the 5th floor without detection, but Ramon was showing obvious signs of neurological impairment. His speech was becoming slurred, his coordination was declining, and he was having difficulty concentrating on complex tasks. Most disturbing, he was beginning to show the same aggressive responses that we had observed in other infected individuals when they encountered potential threats. Dr. Chen's medical evaluation confirmed what we all feared. Ramon had perhaps 2 or 3 hours before his condition progressed to the point where he would pose a danger to the rest of us, but we still needed his security access to reach the 6th floor, and we couldn't afford to leave him behind where he might be discovered and used to track our movements. The decision we made next tested every principle of loyalty and survival that any of us had ever held. We agreed that Ramon would use his remaining time to get us as close as possible to the broadcast equipment, and when his condition became too dangerous, he would create a diversion that would allow the rest of us to complete the mission while drawing attention away from our actual objective. Ramon accepted this plan with the kind of quiet dignity that reminded me why I had trusted him from the beginning. He knew that his infection meant he was going to die regardless of what choices we made, but he was determined to ensure that his death served a purpose that might save other people from experiencing the same fate. During our movement toward the 5th floor, Ramon shared information about the hospital's security systems that revealed just how extensively the building had been modified for the experiments. The areas we had thought were secure were actually being monitored by systems that recorded not just visual and audio information, but also biometric data like heart rate, body temperature, and stress hormone levels. The people conducting the experiments had been tracking our physical and emotional responses to different situations, using our reactions as additional data points in their research. The approach to the 6th floor required bypassing 3 separate security checkpoints, each designed to prevent unauthorized access to the hospital's most sensitive areas. The broadcast equipment was located in a section that housed critical communication and data processing systems, and the security measures protecting it were among the most sophisticated I had ever encountered. The first checkpoint required both Ramon's security credentials and a biometric scan that verified his identity through fingerprint and retinal analysis. Under normal circumstances, this would have been impossible to bypass, but Ramon's deteriorating condition actually worked in our favor. The infection had altered his biometric signature enough that the system registered him as being under severe stress, which triggered emergency protocols that allowed us to proceed with additional security verification rather than being denied access completely. The second checkpoint was more challenging because it required not just identification, but also authorization codes that changed every few hours. Ramon's condition had progressed to the point where remembering complex numerical sequences was becoming difficult, but his muscle memory from years of entering these codes allowed him to complete the process despite his cognitive impairment. But as we worked our way through these obstacles, we discovered something that changed our understanding of the entire operation. The broadcast equipment wasn't just used for emergency communications. It was connected to a data network that linked Ochsner Medical Center with similar facilities across the southeastern United States, allowing real-time coordination of experimental activities and sharing of research results. The terminals we accessed revealed the scope of Project Lazarus in ways that exceeded our worst fears. The network connected research facilities in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Each facility was conducting experiments with different variations of the experimental substance, testing everything from infection rates to neurological control mechanisms to conversion efficiency. The documents we found in the communication center revealed that the New Orleans operation was just one component of a much larger program, and that similar experiments were being conducted simultaneously at dozens of locations across multiple states. The data being collected from these experiments was being compiled into a comprehensive database that would be used to implement what they called the national deployment phase. Sarah's analysis of the medical protocols described in these documents confirmed that the experimental substance had been refined over several years of testing, with each iteration improving its effectiveness and reducing the time required for complete neurological transformation. The version being used in New Orleans represented the final operational variant that would be deployed nationwide once the field testing was complete. But the most chilling revelation came from Dr. Chen's examination of the pharmaceutical documentation. The experimental substance wasn't being manufactured in secret government laboratories. It was being produced by major pharmaceutical companies under contracts that disguised the true nature of the product they were creating. The same companies that manufactured legitimate vaccines and medications were also producing biological weapons that would be used against American citizens. The manufacturing records showed that production facilities in 12 different states were involved in creating components of the experimental substance, with final assembly occurring at secure locations that were operated jointly by government agencies and private contractors. The supply chain was designed to ensure that no single facility had complete knowledge of what they were producing, while allowing for rapid scaling of production when the national deployment phase was implemented. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond government agencies and medical institutions. It included pharmaceutical corporations, university research facilities, and private contractors who were all participating in the development and testing of weapons designed to transform ordinary people into controllable biological assets. As we absorbed this information, Ramon's condition reached the point where he could no longer safely remain with our group. The neurological deterioration had progressed to the point where he was beginning to show the same predatory responses that characterized the affected individuals, and his security training was being overridden by impulses that he could no longer control. The transformation we witnessed in Ramon during his final hours taught us more about the infection process than all of our previous observations combined. The experimental substance didn't just kill people and reanimate their bodies. It selectively destroyed specific areas of the brain while leaving others intact, creating beings that retained enough cognitive function to follow complex instructions while eliminating their capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning. Ramon's technical knowledge remained intact, even as his personality disappeared. He could still operate security systems and navigate the hospital's layout, but he was losing the ability to care about the consequences of his actions or the well-being of the people around him. The infection was creating a being that possessed all of his skills and knowledge but none of his humanity. The farewell we shared with Ramon was brief but profound. He gave us his security credentials and access codes, along with detailed instructions for reaching the broadcast equipment and activating the emergency transmission system. Then he made his way toward a different section of the 6th floor, where his presence would draw attention away from our actual objective while giving us the time we needed to complete our mission. What Ramon did next demonstrated the kind of courage that transcends ordinary human limitations. Instead of simply creating a distraction, he used his remaining time to access the hospital's main security database and download every piece of information he could find about Project Lazarus and the nationwide deployment plans. Then he transmitted that information to law enforcement agencies, news organizations, and government officials who weren't part of the conspiracy. His final act was to trigger every alarm system in the hospital simultaneously, creating enough chaos and confusion to mask our activities, while ensuring that outside authorities would be forced to investigate what was happening at Oxner Medical Center. By the time the affected individuals and their handlers reached his location, Ramon had already succumbed to the final stage of infection, but he had accomplished more in his last hour than most people achieve in a lifetime. The chaos that Ramon created gave us the opportunity we needed to reach the broadcast equipment, but it also meant that our window of time for completing the transmission was extremely limited. Security personnel and affected individuals were converging on the 6th floor from multiple directions, and it would only be a matter of minutes before they located us. My locksmith skills were tested to their absolute limits as I worked to bypass the final security measures protecting the broadcast equipment. The system required multiple types of authorization, from electronic keypads to biometric scanners to mechanical locks that hadn't been updated in decades. Each layer of security required a different approach and different tools, and I had to work with the kind of speed and precision that my grandfather had drilled into me during years of training. The final lock protecting the broadcast equipment was a mechanical system that my grandfather would have recognized, a complex arrangement of pins and tumblers that required not just technical skill, but also the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from years of experience. As I worked on that lock, I could hear his voice in my head, reminding me that every lock tells a story, and that the key to opening any lock is understanding what the person who installed it was trying to protect. Dr. Chen and Sarah worked together to prepare the information we would transmit, organizing the evidence we had gathered into a coherent presentation that would convince anyone who received it that the threat was real and immediate. They compiled medical data, pharmaceutical documentation, government communications, and eyewitness testimony into a comprehensive package that told the complete story of what had been done to the people of New Orleans. But as I finally gained access to the broadcast system, we discovered that our problems were far from over. The equipment was more complex than we had anticipated, and activating the emergency transmission required knowledge of procedures and protocols that none of us possessed. We had the access we needed, but we didn't have the technical expertise to use it effectively. That's when Sarah's emergency response training proved invaluable. She had worked with similar communication systems during disaster response exercises, and, while the hospital's equipment was more sophisticated than what she was familiar with, the basic principles were the same. Working together, we managed to activate the emergency broadcast system and establish connections with multiple external networks. The transmission we sent that night reached far more people than we had dared to hope. The emergency broadcast system was connected not just to local networks, but to regional and national communication systems that distributed our message across the southeastern United States. Within hours, law enforcement agencies, news organizations, and government officials in dozens of states had received detailed information about Project Lazarus and the biological weapons testing that was being conducted on American soil. But our success in transmitting the information came at a tremendous cost. The process of accessing and activating the broadcast equipment had taken longer than we anticipated, and security personnel had traced our location through the very systems we were using to send our message. By the time we completed the transmission, the 6th floor was surrounded by affected individuals and their handlers, and our escape routes had been systematically blocked. The final phase of our mission required abandoning the broadcast equipment and finding a way to survive long enough to ensure that the information we had transmitted would reach people who could act on it. But the hospital had been transformed into a controlled environment where every movement was monitored and every potential hiding place was known to our enemies. As we prepared to leave the communication center, I realized that everything we had accomplished over the past 3 days had led to this moment. We had gathered the evidence, we had found a way to transmit it to the outside world, and we had ensured that the truth about Project Lazarus would be revealed regardless of what happened to us personally. But we had also learned that the conspiracy we were fighting was larger and more deeply entrenched than any of us had imagined. The biological weapons program that had been tested in New Orleans was just one component of a systematic effort to transform American society through forced infection and neurological modification. The people conducting these experiments had the resources and authority to implement their plans on a national scale, and they were prepared to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. The next few hours would determine whether our sacrifice had been sufficient to prevent a national catastrophe, or whether we had simply delayed an inevitable transformation that would turn millions of Americans into controllable biological weapons. And as we prepared to face whatever came next, I knew that the locksmith skills my grandfather had taught me were about to be tested in ways that would determine not just our survival, but the future of everyone we were trying to protect. The story that Oxnard Medical Center had been telling was nearing its conclusion, but the larger story of Project Lazarus and the battle for the soul of America was just beginning. The transmission had been sent, but our situation was now more desperate than ever. As alarms blared throughout Oxnard Medical Center and emergency lights bathed the 6th floor in an eerie red glow, I could hear the coordinated movement of affected individuals and their handlers converging on our location. Ramon's sacrifice had given us the time we needed to expose Project Lazarus to the outside world, but it had also ensured that the people running this operation would stop at nothing to prevent us from escaping alive. Dr. Chen, Sarah, and I found ourselves trapped in the communication center with no obvious escape route. The corridors we had used to reach the 6th floor were now crawling with security personnel, who knew exactly where we were and what we had accomplished. Every exit from the communication center led directly into areas that were being systematically searched by teams that included both human handlers and their affected subordinates. But my grandfather's teachings about reading buildings and understanding security systems had prepared me for exactly this kind of situation. During my work installing the pharmacy locks 3 days earlier, I had studied the hospital's architectural plans and identified features that most people never noticed. Oxnard Medical Center was an old building that had been renovated and expanded multiple times over the decades, and those renovations had created hidden spaces and forgotten passages that weren't reflected in the current floor plans. While Dr. Chen and Sarah gathered the most critical documents we had discovered about Project Lazarus, I used my locksmith tools to access a maintenance panel that concealed entry to the building's original ventilation system. The passages were narrow and uncomfortable, but they provided a route that bypassed the main corridors where our enemies were conducting their search. The journey through the ventilation system tested every aspect of our physical and mental endurance. We had to crawl through spaces that were barely large enough for human passage, navigate in complete darkness using only the small flashlight from my toolkit, and remain absolutely silent while teams of searchers passed directly beneath us. But the route also allowed us to observe the true scope of the operation that was being conducted throughout the hospital. From our hidden vantage points in the ventilation system, we could see into areas of the hospital that had been completely transformed since the outbreak began. Entire floors had been converted into research laboratories where CDC officials and their associates were conducting experiments on both affected individuals and uninfected survivors who had been captured during the chaos. The hospital wasn't just a testing ground for biological weapons. It was a full-scale research facility where human beings were being used as laboratory specimens. We observed procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Uninfected survivors were being deliberately exposed to different concentrations of the experimental substance to study infection rates and transformation timelines. Affected individuals were being subjected to various forms of neurological manipulation to test the limits of their controllability. Most horrifying of all, some survivors were being kept in a partially infected state, conscious enough to understand what was happening to them, but unable to resist the procedures being performed on their bodies and minds. The documentation we had transmitted to outside authorities was comprehensive, but witnessing these experiments firsthand revealed that the scope of Project Lazarus extended far beyond what we had been able to prove through documents alone. The people conducting these experiments weren't just testing biological weapons for potential future use. They were refining techniques for the systematic dehumanization and control of entire populations. Dr. Chen's medical expertise allowed her to understand the scientific implications of what we were observing better than Sarah or I could. She explained that the procedures being conducted weren't random experiments, but carefully designed studies that were building toward specific objectives. The researchers were developing methods for controlling not just the behavior of affected individuals, but also their cognitive abilities, emotional responses, and even their capacity for independent thought. The goal wasn't just to create biological weapons that could be directed against enemy populations. The goal was to create a technology that could transform any population into a controllable workforce that would serve the interests of whoever possessed the ability to direct them. The experimental substance was designed to preserve enough human intelligence and capability to be useful, while eliminating the aspects of human nature that made people unpredictable or resistant to authority. As we continued our movement through the ventilation system, we intercepted radio communications that revealed the immediate threat we were facing. The security teams searching for us weren't just trying to recapture escaped witnesses. They were implementing what they called a facility sterilization protocol, which involved eliminating all evidence of Project Lazarus, while preparing the hospital for what they described as normal operations resumption. This meant that every person in the building who wasn't part of the authorized research team would be eliminated, including the affected individuals who had served as test subjects. The experiments were concluding, and the researchers were preparing to destroy all physical evidence of what they had done, while preserving only the data and biological samples that would be needed for the national deployment phase. The timeline for this sterilization protocol was extremely tight. We had perhaps 2 hours before the entire hospital would be swept by teams whose job was to ensure that no witnesses, no evidence, and no test subjects survived to reveal what had happened at Oxner Medical Center. The building would then be cleaned, restored, and returned to normal medical operations with cover stories prepared to explain the temporary closure and the disappearance of anyone who might ask inconvenient questions. But the radio communications also revealed something that gave us hope. The transmission we had sent to outside authorities was already having an impact. Law enforcement agencies, news organizations, and government officials who weren't part of the conspiracy were demanding immediate access to the hospital to investigate the allegations we had made. The people conducting Project Lazarus were facing pressure from multiple directions, and their ability to maintain control of the situation was beginning to break down. Federal agents who weren't part of the conspiracy were en route to the hospital with warrants that would allow them to conduct a full investigation of the facility. News crews were setting up outside the hospital perimeter, and their broadcasts were bringing national attention to the situation. Most importantly, military personnel who had been told they were responding to a terrorist attack were beginning to question their orders as information about the true nature of the crisis began to reach them through unofficial channels. The cover story that had been used to justify the lockdown of Oxner Medical Center was falling apart, and the people responsible for Project Lazarus were running out of time to complete their sterilization protocol before outside authorities gained access to the evidence of what they had done. This created both an opportunity and a tremendous danger for our survival. If we could remain hidden long enough for outside authorities to reach us, we might be rescued before the sterilization teams found us. But if the people conducting the operation decided that maintaining their cover story was more important than completing a thorough cleanup, they might resort to more drastic measures that would eliminate all evidence of Project Lazarus regardless of the consequences. Sarah's analysis of the emergency response procedures she had observed during her nursing career suggested that the authorities approaching the hospital were following protocols that assumed they were dealing with a medical emergency rather than a military operation. This meant they would be vulnerable to the same kind of deception that had been used to implement Project Lazarus in the first place, and they might be manipulated into supporting the cover story rather than investigating the true nature of the situation. The ventilation system route eventually brought us to the hospital's basement level, where we discovered something that changed our understanding of the entire operation. The basement contained a fully equipped laboratory facility that had been constructed specifically for Project Lazarus research, complete with containment systems, data processing equipment, and storage areas for biological specimens. But most significantly, the basement laboratory contained production equipment for manufacturing the experimental substance. Ochsner Medical Center wasn't just a testing site for biological weapons that had been developed elsewhere. It was a production facility that was actively manufacturing the substance that would be used in the national deployment phase. The production records we found in the basement laboratory revealed that the hospital had been producing enough of the experimental substance to infect hundreds of thousands of people. The manufacturing operation had been disguised as legitimate pharmaceutical production, with the experimental substance being packaged and labeled as routine flu vaccines that would be distributed to healthcare facilities across the southeastern United States. Dr. Chen's examination of the production records confirmed that the substance being manufactured at Ochsner was identical to the experimental vaccine that had been administered to the test subjects during the outbreak. But the production schedules indicated that massive quantities of the substance had already been shipped to distribution centers in major cities across multiple states, where it was waiting to be deployed during what the records described as a coordinated national vaccination campaign. The national deployment phase wasn't a future possibility that might be implemented if the testing proved successful. It was an immediate reality that was already in motion, with millions of doses of the experimental substance positioned for distribution to healthcare facilities that would administer it to unsuspecting patients who believed they were receiving protection against a seasonal flu outbreak. The timeline for this deployment was terrifyingly short. According to the production schedules, the national vaccination campaign was set to begin within 2 weeks, using the same public health justifications that had been used to implement the testing phase in New Orleans and other selected cities. The people responsible for Project Lazarus had used the limited testing phase to refine their procedures and eliminate potential problems, and they were now ready to implement their biological weapons program on a scale that would affect millions of Americans. But the basement laboratory also contained something that gave us the tools we needed to stop this deployment. The facility included communication equipment that was connected directly to the National Pharmaceutical Distribution Network, allowing us to access the shipping records and delivery schedules for every facility that was scheduled to receive the experimental substance. Sarah's emergency response training included experience with pharmaceutical distribution systems, and she was able to use the laboratory's equipment to send alerts to healthcare facilities across the country, warning them that specific batch numbers of flu vaccine contained experimental substances that posed extreme danger to patients. Her alerts included detailed information about how to identify the contaminated vaccines and instructions for safely disposing of them without exposing healthcare workers to infection. While Sarah worked to prevent the national deployment, Dr. Chen used the laboratory's research equipment to analyze samples of the experimental substance and develop countermeasures that could be used to treat people who had been exposed. Her analysis confirmed that the substance could be neutralized if treated quickly enough, but it also revealed that the neurological damage caused by the infection process was irreversible once the transformation reached a certain stage. Meanwhile, I used my Locksmith skills to access the laboratory's data storage systems and download every piece of information about Project Lazarus that we could find. The data included not just research results and production records, but also the identities of everyone involved in the conspiracy, from government officials to pharmaceutical executives to university researchers who had participated in developing the biological weapons technology. The information we gathered in that basement laboratory was enough to expose every aspect of Project Lazarus and ensure that the people responsible would be held accountable for their crimes against humanity. But we still faced the immediate challenge of surviving long enough to ensure that this information reached the authorities who were approaching the hospital. The sterilization teams had systematically searched every floor above us, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the basement level. We could hear them moving through the building, eliminating evidence and disposing of anything that might reveal the true nature of the experiments that had been conducted. The affected individuals who had served as test subjects were being systematically eliminated, along with any equipment or documentation that might be discovered by investigating authorities. But our time in the basement laboratory had given us something that the sterilization teams didn't expect us to have. We now understood the complete layout of the facility, including escape routes that had been built specifically for use by authorized personnel during emergency situations. These routes connected the basement laboratory to a tunnel system that extended beyond the hospital perimeter, allowing researchers to evacuate the facility without being observed by anyone who might be monitoring the building's official exits. The tunnel system had been designed to ensure that Project Lazarus personnel could escape detection even if their operations were discovered by unauthorized individuals. But the same tunnels that were meant to protect the conspiracy could also provide us with a way to escape the hospital while carrying the evidence that would expose everything they had done. The journey through the tunnel system was long and dangerous, but it eventually brought us to an exit point in a building several blocks away from Oxner Medical Center. By the time we emerged from the tunnels, the hospital was surrounded by federal agents, news crews, and military personnel who were demanding access to investigate the situation. The evidence we had gathered during our 3 days inside the hospital provided authorities with everything they needed to expose Project Lazarus and prevent the national deployment phase. The shipping alerts that Sarah had sent prevented the distribution of contaminated vaccines to healthcare facilities across the country. The research data that Dr. Chen had analyzed led to the development of treatments for people who had been exposed to the experimental substance. And the documentation I had collected resulted in the arrest and prosecution of dozens of individuals who had participated in the conspiracy. But perhaps most importantly, our survival and testimony ensured that the American people learned the truth about what their own government had been prepared to do to them in the name of national security. The biological weapons program that had been disguised as medical research was exposed and dismantled, and new safeguards were implemented to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. The 3 days I spent trapped in Oxner Medical Center taught me that the skills my grandfather had passed down to me weren't just about opening locks and bypassing security systems. They were about understanding how power works, how institutions function, and how ordinary people can resist when those institutions are used against them. Every lock tells a story, my grandfather used to say, and every building has secrets that can be discovered if you know how to look for them. The story that Oxner Medical Center told was one of betrayal and conspiracy, but it was also a story about the courage of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph simply because it was powerful and well organized. Ramon, Dr. Chen, Sarah, and I were just 4 people caught in an impossible situation, but we had skills and knowledge that allowed us to make a difference when it mattered most. We proved that even the most sophisticated conspiracy can be defeated if enough people are willing to stand up and fight for the truth. The locksmith skills that saved our lives during those 3 days weren't really about mechanical expertise or technical knowledge. They were about persistence, attention to detail, and the refusal to accept that any barrier is truly insurmountable. Those are skills that anyone can develop, and they're skills that may be needed again if the people in power ever decide that ordinary citizens are expendable in pursuit of their larger objectives. The zombie outbreak that began with Mrs. Evangeline Boudreau's transformation in Emergency Room 3 was stopped before it could spread beyond the controlled testing environment. But the mindset that created Project Lazarus, the willingness to treat human beings as expendable test subjects in service of government objectives, didn't die with the exposure of that particular conspiracy. That's why I'm sharing this story with you now. Not just to document what happened during those 3 days in October 2024, but to remind you that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that vigilance requires each of us to develop the skills and knowledge We need to recognize and resist when our own institutions are turned against us. The next time someone in authority tells you that exceptional measures are necessary for your own protection, remember Mrs. Boudreau and the hundreds of other people who trusted their government to keep them safe, and instead became victims of an experiment they never consented to participate in. And remember that sometimes the most important skill you can have is knowing how to get through doors that powerful people want to keep locked, whether those doors are made of steel and secured with electronic systems, or whether they're made of lies and secured with the assumption that ordinary people will never have the courage to challenge authority when that authority is being used to harm them. The story I've told you happened in one hospital in one city during 3 days in October, but the larger story it represents is happening everywhere, all the time, whenever people in power decide that their objectives are more important than the rights and welfare of the people they're supposed to serve. Your job is to stay alert, stay informed, and stay ready to act when your skills and knowledge are needed to protect the people around you. Because the next time something like Project Lazarus is implemented, you might be the only person in position to stop it before it's too late. And when that moment comes, remember that every lock can be opened if you understand what the person who installed it was trying to protect, and that sometimes the most secure systems can be defeated by someone who refuses to accept that they're supposed to stay locked out. That's the lesson my grandfather taught me, and it's the lesson that saved our lives during the first 72 hours of what could have been the end of human freedom in America. Now it's your turn to learn those lessons and be ready to use them when they're needed most.